Right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final set of slides on this module on presentation skills. My name is Afir Nagdi, and we've been um, going through some of the most important elements to consider when setting up your presentation, and thereafter the elements you need to consider when putting together your pitch deck. Um, so what we'll be doing in this set of lectures is essentially continuing from the last set where we were talking about entity specific elements that you need to make sure in your pitch deck so that potential investors or donors are aware of what are the things that make your organization unique, and why it enables or why it's a good opportunity for them to either invest or be involved in some capacity. And so just a quick recap. Excuse me, we were talking about some of the more important elements around framing your organization within the context of a problem. So we said that if you can identify with suitable, credible data that is appropriately referenced. What are the issues or what are the problems out there in the market which your organization either solves or addresses in some form through your products or services? Then you're in a position to then demonstrate the value proposition of your organization in a way that becomes appealing for investors and donors to understand. We also said that in order to frame this problem appropriately, it is useful to consider the stakeholders to which this problem relates. So, who is currently affected by this problem? How are they affected? To what extent they are affected? And how your products or services address the way in which these people are affected to the extent that it lessens their burden or it entirely solves their problem. We then said part of that means understanding your market, demarcating segments, and explaining to your investors how you will be tackling those markets. And that's something that we'll speak about in a lot more detail in the set of slides. So let's take a look at where we are in terms of the finances when we talk about an organization. So everything we've spoken about up till now has been fairly qualitative in nature. Things like your mission, your vision, things like your team, who the people are, what sort of experience and skills they bring to the table. We also spoke about the problem that your organization solves, how it intends to solve it with products or services. But all of that really doesn't mean much if the numbers don't make sense. And so the key part of any slide deck or any pitch comes down to the money. Okay, and whether investors and donors show it or whether they openly admit it, in my experience, it all comes down to rands and cents. So if your pitch makes sense with regards to the numbers, we have a far greater chance of being supported. And so if you articulate those numbers in a very clear manner, one that is easy and concise for investors and donors to understand, that's where the real change comes in. So let's talk about the money. So essentially, part of your pitch deck needs to talk about how your product makes money or how your service makes money. So at a very granular level, you need to come down to basics and say, this is my product. I am selling cakes, or I'm selling flowers, I'm selling accounting services. Very, very granular. So you need to get down to the specifics and say, this is what we actually sell. These are our products. And if you have a range of products, it's useful to go into some detail around what those products entail so that the investors and donors can understand what it is exactly that you're offering to the market. And more importantly, why are people paying you for it? So if you can articulate that very clearly, in other words, what you are selling, why people are buying it, how much they're paying for it, those are the important elements to consider at a very, very simple level. Okay. It's also useful to unpack your business model. Okay, so typically depending on the complexity of your organization, you sell more than one thing. You sell it to more than one group of people. You sell it for different prices, and so those are the different elements that you need to unpack and explain where appropriate. Um, Remember that in order to demonstrate this, you don't need a lot of convoluted spreadsheets. You don't need data intense documents that are part of your slideshow. Remember that in most cases you will have a presentation pack, and included in your presentation pack you can put in the numbers in detail. So that's essentially something for the investors to go and take a look at after the presentation and not during the presentation. So during the presentation you want to draw their attention to certain key features of the financials. So for instance, very important, how much of revenue did you generate last year? What was your total expenses last year? What was your profitability last year? How did that improve from the previous year or decline from the previous year? What were the reasons for that improvement or decline? So very top level numbers, things like expectations around where you intend to go with your sales and profitability. So these are some of the larger, more macro finance concepts that you want to bring into play. So detailed income statements, balance sheets, etc., although they need to be part of the pack, you don't need to necessarily address them in a lot of detail during the presentation itself. Okay, so when we talk about money, investors want to know where you're going to make more money from, okay, and how are you going to expand, how you're going to grow. If you are a non-profit organization, then we talk about the beneficiaries or the impact. So how much of impact have you had currently, and how do you plan to have even more impact in time to come? And that's what your investors and donors are interested in. So when we speak about growth, okay, the input into growth is definitely in most cases marketing driven. In other words, getting your name out there and getting people interested in what you do and supporting what you do either through clients or through through other sort of partnership or joint venture agreements. And so you need to, as part of this growth strategy, explain to your potential investors how do you plan on getting your customers' attention. Okay, so we speak about things like advertising and what sort of platforms you'll be using. So are you going to go heavy into social media? Have you gone into social media previously? And if so, which platforms were you successful on? Were you successful on Instagram and Facebook and, not so much on Twitter? Break it down at that level to show your investors that you really understand the marketing game, you understand the trends, you understand where impact is made in terms of different social media platforms. And what's very useful for investors to understand is what do the numbers look like. So how successful were you previously? How much of impact have you had previously? And so you want to support your pitch with information around solid numbers, things like how many impressions how many impressions you generated, how many views you generated, how much of engagement was there with your posts, and why these platforms are useful platforms. Outside of the social media space, you want to talk about, for instance, traditional media such as radio, TV, billboards, etc. But it's important to have the data to back up why you made those marketing decisions and why additional funding will contribute to additional contribute to additional marketing or additional impact as well. It's also important to demarcate your target market. Remember that, like I said previously, depending on the complexity of your organization, you may have more than one target market segment, and you'll be selling differently to different segments. So a typical example would be, a product that speaks to, people who are young and old, for instance, and perhaps social media platforms, Instagram, even the newer ones like TikTok, for instance, are suitable for teens and young adults, whereas those will most probably won't be useful platforms for targeting older people. And so you need to explain and demonstrate to your investors why different market segments have been demarcated, and the reason for that simply lies in the platforms that these different demographics engage with. And so you want to show that you understand your market and you understand the segmentation in your market very well. You should also drop a market analysis. So you need to understand what your competitors are doing, and you need to show your investors that you understand what they're doing. So things like competitor pricing, competitor market share, geographic areas of operation. These are very, very important things that you need to be aware of, not only for your own success, but for mitigating risks from your competitors. And these are definitely things that potential investors would speak about. Why should they invest in you when they can invest in your competitors and get better returns or better impact? And those are the things that you need to unpack very, very clearly. Talking about your growth forecasts, okay, remember to keep it realistic. Okay, you need to show how you've historically performed and how you intend to perform in the future. And of course, that is driven by certain assumptions, which we'll speak about in a moment. And so, of course, when we speak about the financials, we want to put down solid numbers. Ideally, in any pitch, depending on the life of your organization or how long you are in practice, you want to always have a solid set of financial statements, preferably audited. And this just gives credibility to your organization, and gives comfort to the users of those financial statements, where they are confident that the numbers in there have been checked, they have been verified, and there's some degree of control within the organization from a financial perspective. And of course, any investor will rely on financial statements and management reports to make further decisions. And if they have comfort that you already have the necessary financial controls in place and the record keeping mechanisms in place, that has a major advantage in place in your favor in a very, very big way. Like I said previously, you want to have your income statement, your balance sheet, your cash flow statements, your forecast, etc. However, you don't want to be addressing these very, very detailed and data intensive reports with a lot of intensity during the presentation itself. Instead, you want to highlight some key features which the investors can then reflect on and sort of verify later on with a lot more detail. Remember that one of the key aspects of this entire presentation will lie in discussing your underlying assumptions. So when we're speaking about growth, and when we're speaking about forecasts, all right, remember that all of these figures are there's no human or technological way of predicting the future. I mean, that's just a given. And so most investors take your forecast with a pinch of salt. Is someone who looks at forecasts on a regular basis, I can tell you from experience that every company that comes in and delivers a pitch for funding or for partnership is the next big thing. So there's no organization that tells you, you know what, we realistically expect that we may run at a loss for the next 2 years before we can turn around, and this is the kind of growth we expect thereafter. So the degree of realism in these forecasts varies greatly from pitch to pitch, and of course you want to be very balanced, you want to be realistic, and you want to be sort of mature and authentic in the way in which you project your future operations. And so one of the important factors to consider when investors look to your forecast will be how you've historically performed. So for example, if you've generated R1 million worth of revenue for the last 2 years, if your projection says, you know what, in year 3 we're going to be generating 10 million rand worth of revenue, the numbers don't tie up from a logical perspective. So historical performance is usually a very good indicator of future performance, and those are the kind of questions that you'll be facing and the kind of questions that you'll need to answer. Remember, if you can find data on similar companies, similar startups with we've been around in the market for a similar amount of time, that provides a useful benchmark for investors and donors to use when assessing your organization, and whether or not they want to be involved with you. And lastly, one of the most important elements of discussing the finances lies in explaining to your donors or your investors how you intend to use their funding. So be wary and be cautious of going um, into an explanation that shows you, for instance, using a large portion of their funding to pay off previous debt. It just doesn't reflect well and doesn't give a good impression of your growth prospects. So you want to avoid those subtleties. Remember, what's important here is to explain your use of funds within the context of KPIs and the targets that you want to achieve. So when you are attaching numbers to your growth, when you're attaching numbers to how you will be spending the money, you want to spend that money within the context of showing your investors how that will contribute to your own growth, and how that will contribute to greater profitability, which effectively means more money for them. In a non-profit context, you want to demonstrate how much more impact you can have with this additional funding, and that becomes very, very important in differentiating yourself from others. Remember, be candid and realistic with the risks involved. So you want to show that you've thought about how things could go wrong, and not only have you thought about it, you've to some extent quantified the risk associated with it as well. Is it to what extent is it likely to happen? Is it highly likely, highly unlikely, etc.? And so you want to engage in a bit of risk management and apply your mind with your board and with your senior management around the risks. And you want to demonstrate that you've thought about these risks, and you've also thought about putting in place contingencies. So in the event that certain risks come to fruition, what sort of backup plans do you have? What sort of contingencies do you have in place? And that relates to all aspects, not just the financial, but operationally as well. And then you also want to indicate, how long this funding is going to last. So you want to be realistic and say, this tranche of funding is probably going to take us to this point, and from this point, we're probably going to need an additional set of funding. And when you can break down your forecasts with this level of understanding, that's effectively what investors want to see, and that provides a very complete picture of why they're getting involved with you. And remember that the overall goal here is to basically stimulate just enough interest for them to invite you over again. It's very unlikely that in this first meeting, the shareholders, the investors are going to sign on the dotted line and support your organization financially. And so you want to get to that point where they say, okay, let's have a sit down again. And of course, in that presentation, your goals then change. So there's some phenomenal pictures that you can look at on YouTube. There's a lovely show that I watch quite regularly called Dragon's Den, and effectively it's somewhat dramatized version of young entrepreneurs who are coming to venture capitalists with business ideas that they're looking to fund. I think what's useful here is to look at some of the great pitches that took place, but also take lessons from the horrible ones. So if you go onto YouTube and you look for some of these, you'll find some of the great ones. You'll also find some of the really bad ones. So I'll encourage you to spend some time watching these shows. They are really entertaining, but also informative at the same time. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to come to an end, and thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to get in touch. So good luck, and I hope to see you soon. All the best.